The air down here is heavy with dust. To reach these corridors, you have to descend past centuries of buried sediment, feeling the sheer weight of the earth pressing in on all sides. Despite lacking modern machinery, ancient builders carved out sprawling defensive labyrinths, engineering massive complexes designed to vanish into the surrounding landscape. We find their remnants scattered across the globe, drowned beneath coastal waters or stretching for miles below modern cities, entirely hidden from the surface. To see how far these builders pushed the boundaries of the uninhabitable, we have to look to the edge of the Judean desert. The Judean desert offers no mercy. Temperatures often exceed 100 degrees. The soil is baked clay and limestone, and surface water is practically non-existent. Rising abruptly from this terrain is a colossal, isolated rock plateau. This is Masada. Its summit sits suspended over a 400-meter drop, surrounded by sheer, jagged cliffs on every side. Reaching the top requires scaling a narrow, serpentine pathway. For the original builders, hauling thousands of tons of quarried stone and timber up these vertical faces was a requirement of construction. Constructing a fortified city here was an act of defiance against the geography of the region. The architects forced a permanent stronghold into an absolute void. King Herod the Great identified this desolation as a strategic sanctuary, ordering his engineers to transform the lifeless summit into a safe haven. They achieved this by carving terraces directly into the northern cliff face. Retaining walls were anchored into the bedrock to support multi-level pavilions suspended above the abyss. Inside, the utilitarian rock gives way to Roman aesthetics. Bright red and white geometric frescoes coat the interior walls, utilizing imported pigments. The floors feature multicolored circular mosaics. Laying these thousands of individual stone tiles required high-precision craftsmanship in a location completely isolated from raw materials. Immediately outside these opulent rooms, the architecture reverts to pure military function. The living quarters are surrounded by a labyrinth of narrow corridors and thick rock walls designed to repel invaders. Herod's palace was a display of wealth and engineering, designed to show that the crown could dictate its own reality, even in the heart of the desert. This defensive architecture faced one vulnerability. The plateau has no natural springs, leaving the population with no access to water during a siege. To solve this, engineers carved enormous, multi-chambered cisterns directly out of the mountain's internal bedrock. By cutting a network of plastered channels into the rock, the engineers intercepted the violent flash floods that washed through the desert. The water was actively channeled into these massive holding tanks. These networks could hold up to 10 million gallons of water. This capacity could sustain thousands of people for several years, even if the region saw no new rainfall. Extracting that water required constant labor. Workers walked the winding paths daily, hauling heavy clay jars from the lower cisterns to the summit to supply the bathhouses and agriculture. The survival of the fortress was tied to this engineered monopoly on water. Without this subterranean system, the defense of the plateau would have collapsed in weeks. Decades after Herod, the fortress became a refuge for rebels. In response, the Roman 10th Legion marched into the desert to take the mountain. This image shows the remains of a Roman base camp. The legion constructed a permanent, inescapable perimeter wall to ensure no one could leave the mountain. The Romans faced a tactical challenge. Their traditional siege towers and battering rams could not be moved against the vertical cliffs of the plateau. This white earthen ramp is an artificial construction. The Romans applied brute force engineering to reshape the mountain. By packing earth against the western face, they created an incline, allowing siege engines to bypass the vertical cliffs. The siege demonstrated that no static defense could withstand an empire willing to physically reshape the landscape to bypass it. When the legion finally breached the walls and reached the summit, they found the fortress silent and empty of life. Today, the ruins remain as a record of high-precision engineering and the collapse that followed once those systems were breached. To find our next architectural enigma, we must leave the desert behind for a dark, suffocating new environment. Is building a luxury fortress on a desert mountain seems impossible? Our next discovery proves humanity successfully built in even deadlier conditions. We have seen how early architects commanded massive weights of stone across the flat earth, but lifting that ambition into the clouds presented an entirely different physics problem. Rising abruptly from the dense Sri Lankan canopy, the sheer granite column of Sigiriya poses a terrifying vertical obstacle. In the late 5th century, there were no combustion engines to rely on, no high-tensile steel cables, no mechanical cranes. Every pound of material had to ascend through muscle and bone alone. The catalyst for this extreme elevation was fear. Driven by intense paranoia after usurping the throne, King Kasyapa demanded an absolute sanctuary, an impenetrable capital suspended high above his enemies. To build a fortress that no army could reach, his builders had to move an entire capital to a 200-meter summit, creating a permanent habitation on a spire of rock. The execution of Kasyapa's sky-high citadel began at the very base of the 200-meter cliff. Anyone granted access had to ascend through the Lion's Gate. Massive stone paws flank a narrow brick stairway, carved directly into the rock face to intimidate approaching subjects. Higher along this perilous ascent, the builders polished the cliffside rock so thoroughly that the king could see his own reflection as he walked. Far below the treacherous climb, the base of the rock is surrounded by vast symmetrical water gardens. These complex high pressure to feed functional fountains that operated across extreme shifts in elevation. Yet the great mystery lies above the gardens. We still do not have a proven record of how the builders hauled the raw materials up the sheer 90-degree drop. A massive volume of clay brick, heavy timber, and carved stone had to be manually transported to a summit hovering 200 meters in the air, with almost no accessible incline. The irony of Sigiriya is that its extreme isolation could not save its architect. Kasyapa ultimately left his sanctuary to face his brother's forces on the ground, where he met his defeat. Following his fall, the fortress in the clouds was handed over to monks and eventually swallowed whole by the encroaching jungle. The paranoid king lost his empire, but the nameless builders who executed his vision successfully conquered the physical limits of vertical construction. While the engineers in Sri Lanka battled the limits of altitude, another civilization solved an entirely different physical constraint: concentrated, immovable mass. In the towering, jagged peaks of the Peruvian Andes, the engineering focus shifted toward the management of immense, concentrated mass. This is Sacsayhuaman. Its massive tier walls carve a sharp, zigzagging perimeter across the high plateau. The angular layout forced any attacking force to expose their flanks, providing a brutal strategic advantage to the defenders above. But the layout is entirely overshadowed by the scale. Many of the individual stones forming these ramparts weigh between 50 and 200 tons. Each multi-ton boulder is shaped to lock into the exact contours of its neighbors, held in place by friction and gravity alone, without a single drop of mortar. The joints between these irregular polygonal shapes are cut with microscopic precision. In many places, the seams are so tight that a single blade of grass cannot pass between the massive blocks. Because the stones rely entirely on gravity and precise friction, they can shift slightly and settle back into place, making the entire fortress highly resistant to the region's frequent earthquakes. Historical Spanish chronicles record a disastrous attempt by thousands of men to move just one of these enormous stones. They lost control of its massive weight, crushing hundreds of workers in the process. The Inca mastered heavy mass and friction with a precision that modern engineers, equipped with current technology, struggle to fully replicate. From the sky-high plateau in Sri Lanka to the jagged peaks of Peru, these sites provide undeniable physical proof of highly advanced engineering methods that are now lost to us. These architects systematically defeated the constraints of extreme mass, relentless gravity, and high-altitude logistics. But what happens when building fortresses in the sky is no longer enough to keep an enemy at bay? There comes a point when a population is forced to abandon the surface altogether. To survive an inescapable threat above ground, ancient engineers had to do the exact opposite of building toward the heavens. They had to abandon the light entirely. Their only path to survival was digging downward, carving massive, breathing cities into the suffocating depths of Derinkuyu. Last time, we left a civilization exposed. On the open Anatolian plains, traditional walls of stone and wood offered no sanctuary against an overwhelming mobile force. Survival here required a complete inversion of military strategy. To escape an unstoppable enemy, the population abandoned the horizon and retreated into the earth. From the surface, the landscape looks abandoned. Endless valleys of weathered rock and volcanic tuff stretch out, concealing the massive secret buried beneath the topsoil. But just under the surface, the rock gives way to a sprawling, hidden fortress. This is Derinkuyu. Hand-carved into the bedrock, the city descends a staggering 18 stories. Its tunnels and chambers plunge deep into the earth, beyond the sun's reach. At its peak, this labyrinth was large enough to house 20,000 people, sheltering an entire culture within a single stone structure. Engineered as a calculated response to the threat of total erasure, Derinkuyu functioned as a permanent city, built to sustain life in the shadows for as long as the surface remained unsafe. When an invasion force was sighted, the city entered a total lockdown. The priority was absolute: seal every entrance and cut off the enemy's path downward. The primary defense was a series of monolithic circular stone doors. Weighing over 1,000 pounds, they perfectly blocked the narrow corridors. Operated only from the inside, defenders used the central hole for leverage to roll the stone and drive a locking pin through. When the stone clicked into position, the world above disappeared. Thousands of people were instantly plunged into an inescapable total darkness. Once the doors were sealed, the immediate threat of a soldier's blade was gone, but it was replaced by the constant, silent pressure of the underground environment itself. Enclosing 20,000 people in a windowless cave creates an immediate biological crisis. Without a constant intake of air, the population would suffocate in a matter of days. The solution was a network of massive ventilation shafts acting as the city's lungs, pulling fresh air down to the lowest floors. From these main shafts, smaller tunnels branched horizontally, circulating air through every living quarter and preventing the atmosphere from stagnating. After air, the next requirement for survival was a secure, reliable source of water. The architects sank deep wells that bypassed the city floors entirely, tapping into aquifers located hundreds of feet below the surface. Critically, these wells had no connection to the surface rivers or streams that an enemy could access. This isolation prevented an army above from poisoning the water supply, a common tactic used to break a long-term siege. By linking these deep air shafts to isolated water tables, the builders transformed a potential stone tomb into a functional, self-contained habitat. To endure a siege that might last for half a year, the city had to maintain the social structures that kept isolation from turning into chaos. Families lived in small chambers carved into the corridor walls. Their only light came from linseed oil lamps, casting distorted shadows against the volcanic rock. Logistics were essential. Deep storage pits for grain and oil, and excavated stables for livestock ensured they could feed the population through months of confinement. They also carved out communal schools and chapels. These spaces were vital for psychological morale, providing a sense of normalcy while an unseen war continued on the surface. An entire civilization existed as a shadow society, carrying out their daily lives in a perpetual twilight, separated from the horrors above by hundreds of feet of solid earth. The isolation of Derinkuyu was absolute. Entire generations may have been born and lived their lives in these tunnels, never once seeing the sky or feeling the warmth of the sun. It remains a haunting monument to human resilience, a testament to the lengths a people will go to preserve their culture when faced with extinction. But the weight of the earth is only one way to find sanctuary. Eventually, we must return to the open sky. Imagine a different strategy. Instead of retreating into the stone, what if a civilization chose to surround themselves with the infinite expanse of the sea? Next time, we travel to the middle of the Pacific, to a monumental fortress built directly upon the ocean waves. We have seen empires carve fortresses into sheer mountain cliffs and hollow out the earth beneath their feet. But a different set of obstacles arises when an empire has no mountains to climb and no solid ground to dig into. The western Pacific Ocean offers a vast open landscape that appears ill-suited for monumental stone architecture. For civilizations developing on flat, tropical atolls, the geography itself is a vulnerability. There are no towering peaks to retreat to when an enemy approaches, or when the ocean swells. To find safety, these builders were forced to manufacture their own high ground out of the water itself. Built off the eastern shore of Pompeii, Nan Madol is an entirely artificial archipelago, constructed directly in the shallows of the ocean. The site is a precise grid. Nearly 100 man-made islets are separated by a complex network of tidal canals. The perimeter walls and structures are built from thousands of stacked basalt columns. The total weight of this stone is estimated at 750,000 tons. This massive tonnage rests directly on top of a fragile, submerged coral reef. This feat of engineering was completed centuries ago, entirely without structural steel, deep concrete foundations, or heavy machinery. The weight of the stone should have fractured the porous coral or been swept away by tidal surges. Yet this floating citadel has survived the Pacific's reach for centuries. The construction began with the specific geometry of the building blocks. These are naturally occurring prismatic basalt columns, formed by cooling volcanic flows, which had to be harvested from quarries on the opposite side of the main island. A single column can weigh up to 50 tons. Moving dense rock of this size across slippery, tidal mudflats and open water carries extreme risk. The architects of Nan Madol achieved this without wheels, complex pulley systems, or metal tools to cut the rock. Archaeological models suggest a highly patient method of construction. Builders likely strapped the massive stones to rafts, utilizing the extreme shifts of the ocean tide. As the water rose, the stones were floated into position and settled into place as the tide receded. The construction of Nan Madol relied on synchronizing human effort entirely with the natural rhythms of the ocean. This immense labor was commanded by the Sacsayhuaman dynasty. They consolidated power over Pompeii and used the strict grid-like isolation of Nan Madol to keep their potential rivals observed and entirely dependent on the mainland for food and fresh water. Today, the quiet, overgrown ruins reflect the heavy authority the Sacsayhuaman wielded over the population. The scale of the labor required gave rise to Pompeian legends. Local mythology claims that twin sorcerers from a distant land levitated the massive basalt logs through the air with the help of a flying dragon. But modern exploration has revealed a reality beneath the waves that challenges the accepted timeline. Deeply submerged, far below the known Sacsayhuaman walls, lie massive, stacked rectangular blocks. Sea levels have not been this low in thousands of years. These submerged foundations indicate that complex construction on this reef began centuries earlier than the official Sacsayhuaman history claims. Nan Madol appears to be a chronological ghost town. Successive generations of rulers arrived, found the sunken remnants of an older society, and built their own legacy directly on top of the ruins of the past. The obsession with building monumental defenses in extreme environments is not an isolated Pacific anomaly, but a universal human trait. We see it in the arid cliffs of the Judean desert, where the besieged rebels of Masada chose to build a society on a high plateau rather than surrender to Rome. We see it rising out of the dense Sri Lankan jungle, where paranoia birthed the towering palace of Sigiriya. It is carved into the high Andes, where the precision-cut, zigzagging megaliths of Sacsayhuaman protected the Inca capital. And we see it beneath the earth, in the massive subterranean tunnels of Derinkuyu. Humanity's instinct to secure its existence drives us to dig as deeply into the earth as we climb into the sky. Returning to the quiet, flooded canals of Nan Madol, the vast scale of human effort comes into focus. These ancient sites are vastly different in their geography, their eras, and the tools used to create them, yet they all represent a shared human instinct. When faced with extreme environments or the threat of annihilation, human beings reshape the physical world to ensure their survival. We pile stone upon stone, against the tides and against the centuries. We build our fortresses, and then we leave them behind, letting the walls speak for us long after we are gone.